of Andrew. Thanks for taking time off to talk to us. I thoroughly enjoyed your latest tome, The Secret World. I believe it's your 17th intelligence theme book.
Yeah, something like that. I've been trying to write a book for less than 1,000 pages for some time, and I'm not succeeding.
What draws you to the world of espionage, subterfuge, and double dealing?
Well, the main thing is simply that it's something that is always left out. What has happened is it's moved over to fiction rather than to real history. Intelligence is the only profession in which a fictional, indeed more than one fictional character, is at least 100 times better known than anyone who was really in it. And that's James Bond. So where people get their idea of what espionage is about is from films and novels, rather than from the historical record, which makes it interesting for a historian.
Your book opens with these great lines: "The first major figure in world literature to emphasize the importance of intelligence was God." Is he or she the person you most admire in the intelligence field? Or do you have particular heroes or heroines?
Well, I certainly pay serious attention to God, and I think that's pretty good advice for everybody, whether or not they believe in her. But at the very beginning, it just shows how central it was to a lot of human activity. What's the big deal so far as the children of Israel are concerned? Getting the promised land. But they hum and ha, and in the end, God has to say to Moses, effectively, no disrespect intended, get on with it. The promised land is over there. Send spies out to spy out the land of Canaan. And then Moses bungles. And that's the first really huge intelligence error in intelligence history. And there is no instance of an intelligence failure in intelligence history which encounters more divine wrath than that one. Once God has calmed down a bit, he still sentences all those who've taken part in the terrible exercise to 40 years in the wilderness. And the only two people who, from the children of Israel at the time of the first attempt to spy out the land of Canaan, who are allowed back, are the only two successful spies. One of which was Joshua, and the other was his friend Caleb. And Moses, what happens to him? He's at the age of 120, which must have been stressful, taken up to the top of Mount Nebo, allowed to get a quick glimpse of the promised land, and then that's it, and over to Joshua. What is often forgotten is that the successful takeover of the promised land, 40 years after the first failed attempt, is a combination of the two oldest professions, allegedly. One is spies, and the other is prostitutes, because the spies that are sent by Joshua into Jericho, which is the city that has to be taken over, lodge with a woman called Rahab the harlot, and she has a brothel in the city walls. And she's of tremendous help, which is why she and her family are saved when all the others are done in. But the Bible reveals, and particularly the beginning of St. Matthew's Gospel, which is the beginning of the New Testament, that she is one of the female ancestors of Jesus. And she gets very favorable mention in two of the epistles. So I don't think any theologian really questions it, but they don't make the point very often that Jesus on his mother's side is descended from the first really famous female spy.
Do you have any heroes or heroines in all your study of intelligence?
Well, I think that those people who most deserve respect are those who make tremendous effort against the odds for something that is really worthwhile and pull it off. And so in the end, Churchill isn't perfect. Nobody is perfect. But he did understand intelligence better than any policymaker had ever understood it before, and it made a difference. I mean, one's only got to imagine what would have happened if Hitler had been able to break British codes rather than Britain being able to break Hitler's codes. So that certainly shortened the Second World War. I think Hitler, from the moment that he's foolish enough to declare war in the same year on Russia and the United States, is going to lose sooner or later. But it would have been later. And what would that have meant? It would have meant, in my judgment, that the first atomic bomb would still have been exploded on the 6th of August, 1945. But it wouldn't have been on Hiroshima. It would have been on the target for which it was first intended, Berlin. And that made a tremendous difference. But what Churchill does is two things which are really quite unusual at nearly all times and all places amongst policymakers. One, he has a very long view. The further backwards you look, he says, the further forward you can see. Secondly, an ability to learn from mistakes, including his own. I mean, he was the man who, during the 1920s, with other ministers, gave away the biggest intelligence secret that Britain had, which is the fact that we could break Russian codes. And then as a result, the Russians adopted a system which we can't deal with. Now, it's because he's learnt from that era that the ultra secret, the secret that we are breaking the German codes, is about the best kept secret in British history. Only even 6 ministers are allowed to know about it. So the old saying that, which like most old sayings is more or less true, those who don't understand past mistakes are doomed to repeat them. Churchill did understand past mistakes, and he didn't repeat them.
What about unsung heroes? I love the stories of Cortez's savior, Malinche, and the pundits.
Yeah.
The pacing through the Himalayas. They had to keep the right pace.
I think the least known major Western intelligence triumph over another continent is also one of the first. I mean, the West only takes a world lead at the beginning of the 16th century. And then there's a most extraordinary victory against odds, which very rarely appear at any other moment in international relations. Cortez, the Spanish conquistador, turns up, and he's never turned up there before, in modern Mexico, is confronted with the Aztec Empire, huge and extremely powerful, and also extremely brutal. And what's he got? He's got 600 men at most, plus a certain number of horses, which I don't think frighten the Aztecs as much as has been suggested. What else has he got? Well, he's given a few slave girls when he arrives, and one turns out to be a woman of extraordinary ability. He never marries her, but she does become his mistress and the mother of his son. And her name in Spanish is La Malinche. And she's able to translate, once she's learned Spanish, from these exotic languages that, of course, none of the Spaniards really speak. Well, there's one priest, but that's about it. And she's able to explain that Montezuma, the hugely powerful Aztec emperor, has lots of enemies. There are other tribes, there are other ethnic groups, there are groups within the Aztecs who would like to get rid of him. So the 600 men beat a 6-figure opponent essentially by having an extraordinary amount of good intelligence. Now, at the time, because La Malinche was a woman, she didn't get the credit that she deserved, but she's just beginning to.
I thought Pizarro did most with even fewer men. I think didn't he arrive with 50 men or?
Pizarro, who's the kind of conquistador that gives conquistadors a bad name.
He's a gangster, I think.
Well, that was on a good day. I mean, he was remarkably successful. But the problem was that he was taken in by conspiracy theories. And that has always been a problem in the history of intelligence.
That's the theme that runs through your book.
So he believes in this city of gold, and people are tortured until they give directions. Well, there is no city of gold, so all the intelligence they get is necessarily false. So he wins an amazing initial victory, but then having won the battle, he loses essentially the plot.
You have recurring themes in your book. Truth to power is mentioned many times. Which moment in history do you believe was the reluctance to tell the truth to power the most catastrophic?
In recent times, as I say, over the last 100 years, I think it's probably in Stalin's Russia. Because if you tell Stalin what he doesn't want to hear, which is any opinion different from his, it's not simply a bad career move. It can seriously shorten your life expectancy. So what happens? At the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 40s, 3 successive intelligence chiefs are executed, the third one a little bit afterwards, essentially for disagreeing with Stalin. And what does that mean? It means that all the good intelligence that is arriving to indicate that Hitler is preparing an invasion in June 1941 is neglected. Now, if Stalin had believed it, not simply hundreds of thousands, but arguably could have got into 7 figures of Russians would have been likely to survive, who were actually killed as a result of a successful surprise attack.
Apparently, fake news had a position in that as well. I was reading that the German Die Abwehr put out some fake news saying that the British papers were all lies and there was no invasion. And
well, the best use of fake news, if you're the person who is putting out the fake news, is not to try and persuade somebody that something that would never have occurred to them, and which they're very skeptical about, is happening, but just to discover illusions that they have, mistakes they've already made, and keep pumping them with more information. Now, they knew that Stalin was more suspicious about Churchill than he was about Hitler. So they feed those suspicions. They do it extremely well.
You also cover the issue of interdepartmental jealousy. That appears regularly in your book as well. I was really interested in the Pearl Harbor catastrophe with the Army month and Navy month, and how that all panned out.
Well, in the end, all bureaucracies within governments are likely to become rivals and get in each other's way. That's why you're supposed to have presidents and prime ministers to sort it all out. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even though often considered the greatest American president of the 20th century, had a serious black spot. And he was very bad at sorting out interdepartmental rivalries. And it is fair to say, ludicrously bad at sorting out interdepartmental rivalries between different intelligence agencies. So here's what happens. At the beginning of the Second World War, the Americans break the Japanese diplomatic code, which they call Purple. And then there are 2 lots of code breakers. One are naval and the other are military. And they both want to take over this extraordinarily valuable source. And Roosevelt can't deal with this. So he produces this extraordinary compromise that one lot of code breakers will break Japanese diplomatic code on ordered dates, and the other will break them on even dates. And that causes chaos on the eve of Pearl Harbor. Because here's what happens. Saturday, the 6th of December, 1941, a diplomatic message is decrypted, which reveals that the Japanese have decided there's going to be no more negotiation. Now, it doesn't tell you where the attack is going to be, but it sure as hell tells you that war is coming. But Saturday, the 6th of December, is an even date. So even though the Navy get the message, they have to pass it on to the Army. But this is Saturday, and the Army's people go off at lunchtime. So they then have to hand it back to the Navy. It's sort of sorted out overnight, and for the first time ever, the 2 lots of rivals collaborate together. Meanwhile, the Japanese are creeping up on Pearl Harbor and attack it completely by surprise.
Interdepartmental conflict happened in 9/11 too, didn't it? Was the FBI wasn't talking to the CIA?
I think the kind of interdepartmental rivalry is a failure not merely of the FBI to talk to the CIA, but the headquarters of the FBI to pay attention to field stations of the FBI is of extraordinary importance and a good example of not learning from such errors in the past. So when one of the field stations, for example, sends FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., the news that there are a number of Islamists who are taking flight training without being particularly interested in how to take off or how to land. And the suggestion from the field offices is, could you ask around and discover if this is going on? It's just ignored. So that is another classic example. And once again, this is what government is supposed to do. You can't blame too much individual departments for being rivals. I mean, that's what departments do. You can blame a government who could have learned from past experience that something needed to be done, which doesn't do it.
Do you think leadership was a problem? For example, you said that there were some very clever men like President Wilson, who was immensely clever, but actually not very good when it came to intelligence. He didn't appreciate intelligence reports, whereas, as you said, Churchill is.
It's difficult to think of any area in which political leadership has made, for better or for worse, a difference than in intelligence. And the reason I think is this, that they are very frequently less aware of past experience and therefore cannot learn from it than in any other area. And this is for one of two reasons, either because the intelligence is so secret that it was not recorded, therefore it's not there for them to be interested in. The other is that they're simply not interested. Now, we're just now on the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. Now, all kinds of interesting points have been made about leadership during that period, with one huge exception. And the huge exception is this. At the beginning of the First World War, H. Asquith, the British leader, the British Prime Minister, was extraordinarily well educated, politically extremely astute. He had got first-class honours from Oxford. He had got a prize fellowship at Balliol College. If anything, President Woodrow Wilson was even better educated. He was the first and probably the last president of a major university, Princeton, to become president. And they were actually less good. And I don't think the evidence is in any way equivocal. They were less good than the best of their 18th century predecessors. So Wilson was not in the same class as George Washington. If George Washington had been that bad, I actually think that he would have lost the Revolutionary War in the winter of 77 to 8. And similarly, even though Britain was just becoming the world leader in signals intelligence derived from message interception and code breaking, Asquith paid virtually no attention to it. Now, in the 7 Years' War, in the middle of the 18th century, Pitt the Elder had circulated intercepts to the cabinet. Would never have occurred to Asquith. This is an area in which it's possible to find 20th century leaders who don't understand the subject as well as some of their predecessors 200 years before.
Is it human nature, or is it just ignorance or a lack of care? Some politicians were great consumers of intelligence and the other ones just didn't care, like you said, like Wilson and Asquith.
Well, I think it's both. But from the moment that an area of understanding is reasonably well known, if you had a prime minister who's paying no attention to economics, I think somebody is going to complain. Mm. But in those days, since intelligence history was almost unknown, you can ignore it and nobody's going to complain.
What do you think about the role of racism in decisions like the lack of belief that Osama bin Laden would actually do any damage to the USA?
Well, racism, as the word is so often used in an extremely crude way, that it's difficult sometimes to remember that it's been extremely important. One of the best ways of ensuring that you get beaten is to underestimate your opponent. And that happens time after time. I mean, if Hitler had been invading, pretty difficult to imagine, the Soviet Union full of Brits and Americans, he wouldn't have supposed that he could defeat them in 6 weeks. but it's because the Slavs are racially inferior. He believes he can do it. And even so far as the Japanese are concerned, well, Churchill regarded them as really not as bright as white men. He used to call them the little yellow men. And that is what Roosevelt thought, even though he didn't say it. So if there'd been reason to fear that a German fleet, or for that matter, a hostile Royal Navy, was on the loose in the Pacific in December 1941, people would have paid attention. But because it was just Japanese, they were less alert to the danger. And it's worth remembering that Douglas MacArthur, in the end, the greatest hero of the victory over Japan, when he heard what had happened at Pearl Harbor, he thought that the aircraft which took off from Japanese aircraft carriers must have been piloted by white mercenaries.
I was reading that the invasion of Hong Kong was at night, and nobody believed that the Japanese were landing because they had poor night vision. So they had something like 12 hours up. So and also the Japanese didn't believe, because the Japanese had quite poor anti-submarine vessels, because they didn't believe the Europeans could actually survive underwater in close quarters.
But I mean, there's, in the end, it's a wonderfully moral conclusion, I think, that one can arrive at. That Hitler, apart from being the greatest racist of the 20th century, is partly defeated by his racism. If he'd taken his opponents seriously, well, at the very least, he wouldn't have been beaten quite as quickly.
State-sanctioned torture. Why does it continue when it's been proven to be an unreliable source of intel?
Because I think the lesson has not been accepted. I think it is now. But you'll recall that George W. Bush claims that various methods, he's not too explicit about what they were, actually were critically important after 9/11 in getting intelligence which prevented another 9/11. The other thing, of course, one of the reasons I think for the ignorance is that they didn't understand past experience. It's highly unlikely that when George W. Bush was deciding in favor of waterboarding, that he realized that it went back to the Spanish Inquisition. Then the Spanish Inquisition having tried it on people in the 16th century, and then when the Spanish took over the Philippines, moving into the Philippines, and then when the Americans moved into the Philippines at the end of the 19th century, taking over from there. If there'd been a long backwards look at what it had achieved, I think they might not have used it. And simply the study of the actual experience of waterboarding over the since the beginning of the 21st century has led people to conclusions which they would have arrived at an awful lot earlier if they'd known earlier experience.
You cover arrogance in your book, the Aspen Brown Commission, and the conclusion that the American intelligence system was much superior.
It was a kind of instinctive belief, this is at the end of the 20th century, which wasn't based on serious evidence. But this happens throughout history to superpowers, or powers who think they were superpowers. So when Britain had an empire, the idea that there was anything to understand about running an empire from, let us say, the French never occurred to anybody at all. And when the French prided themselves on having almost as big an empire and their civilizing mission, the mission civilisatrice, it never occurred to them they had anything whatever to learn from the experience of other imperial powers. And after the Cold War, when Russia has been effectively defeated, the idea that people in Washington think that there is anything of real importance that American intelligence could learn from foreign powers, it just doesn't occur to them. I do remember that I was on a parallel commission to the Aspen Brown one. This was not a classified one, but it had very good people on it and produced a report. And when we saw the final report, I said, well, we seem to have either discovered this was a draft and didn't take into account a few observations that I'd put, but I don't blame them for that. The only reason I got onto it, by the way, was I got a letter from the charity, the 20th Century Fund, since it changed its name, a big think tank, which said, we very much hope that you, Mr. Andrew, as a distinguished American, will agree to take part of it. Well, it had never occurred to the people writing that I could be other than American, because I'd just written a book about American intelligence, which had been published in the United States. Anyway, when they presented with this draft, I said, we appear to have either discovered something very important that we need to spell it out, or made an error so basic that we should correct it. And it is this, that American intelligence has nothing to learn from the combined experience of the rest of the human race, which there was a certain amount of tittering. And there were minor changes made. But there's absolutely no question that if one looks at the way that the Joint Intelligence Committee in Britain, for example, pulled together in intelligence and captured the attention of the Prime Minister and ministers, that doesn't happen to anything like the same extent in the United States.
Still.
Well, I don't. The problem is the United States is too big for all kinds of things, and all you need is an inattentive president, and that's it, really. And it's conceivable that one has an inattentive president at the present time. But it's just the case that the platitudes are obvious. Most platitudes are true. That's how they become platitudes. You need to learn from experience, point one. There's hardly anyone that would deny that. But the second thing is a bit more difficult. You need to learn from other people's experience as well as your own. So what you get at the beginning of the 21st century is an American intelligence community, which, even though technically it can perform wonders, has lost a lot of simple lessons that were learned in the Second World War. And a simple example of these simple lessons is the very end of the war. Now, at the end of the war, preparations have been made to interrogate Adolf Hitler and other Nazi leaders. So Hitler has committed suicide. He's not available. But the number two, Goering, is. And even with gift of hindsight, the questions that were jointly prepared by the British and the Americans, including the best intelligence they have, is very difficult to fault. Now, fast forward to 2003. To use the jargon, the highest valued target, Saddam Hussein, has just been discovered hiding in a hole near Tikrit, his birthplace, in Iraq. So he comes up for interrogation. There are no preparations whatever to interrogate him. The man who was called in after about a week and who has recently written an account of that, explains that when he finally saw him after a week, the most basic errors had already been made. The most basic errors is if you capture an enemy, you want to start asking questions while they feel at a disadvantage. What do they do with Saddam Hussein? Essentially, they say, how about a shower, haircut, change of clothes, and so on. And they give him a week to settle down. And then he's as arrogant as usual by the time that he's interrogated. And it's another 2 months before they even find an Arabic speaker to interrogate him. Now, there couldn't be a more simple lesson than that. And it's forgotten. And if against your highest value target, which Saddam Hussein was, you can make an intelligence error as basic as that, it shows that you're paying too much attention to the technical sophistication of the means available to you, and are paying far too little attention to the underlying truths of the intelligence process through the ages.
Would you like to think that if your book was a required reading with all intelligence agencies, then you would have fewer of these problems?
Yes.
Of
But you see, there are really two possibilities. One that people don't learn from experience? And the answer is they sometimes do, and they sometimes don't. But if they don't know what the experience is, they don't have a chance to learn from it. Now, let me give you one simple example. I mean, sitting here in Cambridge, a generation ago, within 100 yards, there were a series of wartime members of probably the most successful intelligence agency of World War II, Bletchley Park, which broke Hitler's ciphers and produced simply extraordinarily valuable intelligence. So I discovered what they knew, but then I also discovered what they didn't know. Even though there were some really distinguished historians, they hadn't the slightest idea that the last time we were threatened with an invasion, which was by Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century, taken extremely seriously at the time. That's why there are all those Martello towers around the coast. That his codes were broken as well. And indeed, the man who did it was the first British codebreaker to get a knighthood. But the man who got the knighthood, and Wellington and the others, hadn't the slightest idea that the last time that we were, before that we were threatened with a hostile invasion, leaving aside the glorious revolution when William of Orange was invited in, so that doesn't count as an invasion, 1588, that Philip II, King Philip II of Spain, who's sending the Armada against us, his ciphers were broken as well. And, there was an awareness also of the importance of this by Queen Elizabeth I and her leading ministers. She gave the codebreaker chiefly responsible a pension, and he was deluged with compliments. So even these extraordinarily able people, some of whom were extraordinarily able historians as well, had no idea of the long-term history of what they were doing. They could not learn from long-term experience because they didn't know it. They were like economists who had never heard of the Industrial Revolution.
Do you think history should be taught far more forcefully with the people in power? For example, Paul Brennan, who was the boss of Iraq, he demobilized the Iraqi army, so contrary to what happened in post-war Germany, where they kept the police force, they kept a disarmed army, so there wasn't the chaos that happened in.
I think the problem is there is awareness of learning from experience, but not very commonly an awareness of learning from past experience. I mean, I've been told by friends at an extremely good American university that in courses on international relations, trying to persuade the students that even the Cold War is relevant is pretty difficult. No, all that is completely old hat. But those who do have a longer awareness tend to do rather better. And of course, the absolutely classic example of that is Winston Churchill. But another example of, I think, somebody who was a very good foreign secretary, even though he's left politics now, William Hague. He actually wrote a really good biography of Pitt the Younger. Now, contrast that with Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is really interested in classical history, has written a good history of the Roman Empire, and I've been to a school where they use it for teaching in the sixth form. But he's also written a book called The Churchill Factor. Now, what this is about is what we can learn from Churchill. And there is not a word in that book about intelligence. And this was from a man who went on to become, mercifully, quite briefly, a British Foreign Secretary.
What's your opinion on assassinations?
I'm against it. All this is extremely difficult. I mean, it's actually a very simple question, and people should not be assassinated. The problem is if somebody then says, well, how about assassinating Hitler at the beginning of the Second World War? It's quite difficult to produce a reasoned case against that, except, of course, that it's different in war. If you're fighting against other countries and killing their soldiers, I really don't see what the argument is against killing their generals, or for that matter, killing their prime ministers. It's a very dangerous path to move it down. But the basic question, assassination in peacetime, no. I mean, that is very, very easy. And it's very difficult to think of a single peacetime assassination which has achieved anything desirable.
I asked that question because you mentioned that Nixon was contemplating taking out Ellsberg. I thought that was interesting.
Yes, well, the problem, of course, of policymakers is that when they get severely stressed, they're likely to say and think some extremely silly things. But there has recently been, I think, a real change in Russian policy. Now, even though it wasn't the main purpose of Russian foreign policy, killing particularly traitors who had fled abroad, and the great interwar example is obviously Trotsky, was a standard purpose of foreign policy. And after the Second World War, when the dead Trotsky was replaced as the greatest heretic of the Soviet bloc by Tito, there was a carefully worked out plan, which I think could have succeeded, to kill Tito. The reason it wasn't persevered with is that after Stalin died, his successors weren't going to carry on. But they did carry on killing the leaders of Ukrainian nationalism who were living abroad. And they were quite successful, but there were a number of bungles. A couple of the assassins defected. And they stopped doing it in the early 1960s, not because they were against it in principle, but they wondered if they could get away with it in practice. What has happened is Putin has gone some way back to traditional assassination practices. I mean, there's been a very lengthy report on the killing of Alexander Litvinenko, an FSB, successor to the KGB, an FSB defector in London, by the use of radioactive polonium-210. And the judicial report concludes that Putin almost certainly approved it, but secondly, that he's been involved in similar exercises elsewhere. And of course, one such similar exercise more recently is the attempt to assassinate another traitor, but this time a military intelligence, GRU traitor, Sergei Skripin. Now, again, I don't think that there's any real doubt that Putin is behind that. Mercifully, however, Russian assassination is not as competent as it used to be. I mean, there were attempts at the time to argue, oh, well, there's a bungling which preceded the killing of Litvinenko in London in December 2006 was deliberate so that people would realize what's going on. I don't think that's the reason they spilled a certain amount of polonium-210 on the plane coming to London from Moscow and on the plane going back to Moscow. I don't think it's the reason they spilled quite a bit in a sushi bar in Piccadilly either. So the bungling over Skripin, I think, is fortunately something that is limiting Russian assassination plots. They're not as good at it as they used to be.
What's your prediction in regards to the rise of the surveillance state, facial recognition, and the so-called algorithmic governance?
Well, all this depends to a considerable degree on artificial intelligence. I mean, there's too much there for human eyes to scan. Some clearly works rather well. Automatic number plate recognition works extremely well on cars, so by and large, it's possible for the police and other authorized persons to tell whether any passing car of which they're suspicious is insured or isn't, and the same about the driver. I think the problem otherwise is the sheer volume of information you have to absorb. Now, in some cases, number plate recognition, an algorithm is going to work, and in other cases, it won't. And then also, there is simply the problem that what surveillance cannot do is get inside heads. So one of the recurrent problems about the surveillance of Islamist terrorists or potential terrorists is that it's perfectly possible for an individual or a group who have not been a particular threat before suddenly to become radicalized almost overnight to the point at which they're going to attempt to carry something out. And surveillance also at that kind of level, which involves human beings, is astonishingly labor intensive. Now, I'm of such little significance that I've not had very much experience of surveillance. But my experience, once again, indicates just how labor intensive it is. So there I was in December 1990 in Moscow, and I was taking perfectly legally some money over to someone who wasn't allowed to leave the country. My purpose was known, but I was also working for BBC at the time, and then it seems difficult to believe now that Gorbachev had given instructions that the BBC, nobody was to make them feel too uncomfortable. So, of course, the room was booked. That was a standard procedure in a lot of big hotels. When I went up in the lift, somebody got in. They didn't try to intimidate me. It would have been too difficult. At breakfast time, there was somebody by each door, and they were keeping me under surveillance. But it had so little effect on me that even when the waiter put a plate on the table and showed me a tin of caviar, which he offered me for only $5 beneath the table, and I bought it, no attention was being paid. But then, having talked to this individual and given her the various things I brought to her, I knew what to do next. We need to get into a taxi so that we could talk without being bugged, since most taxis were not bugged. Now, how do you do that? In those days, you used to have Marlboro cigarettes because taxi drivers liked them. They used them as a kind of currency. You could have used other kinds, but they liked the ones with the cowboys on the front. So we went to the curb. I held up my hand with 20 Marlboro. Taxi screeched to a halt. We got in the back of it, and I looked behind, and I saw the cars following us. And I said to Layla, "What's it like being followed everywhere you go by 3 cars?" And she said, "No, 2. And I said, "No, look, 1, 2. And then this overwhelming sense of self-importance. Well, the 3rd car was just for me. And then we had further adventures in the evening, which I won't go through. Now, the labor that was necessary to keep somebody with as little significance as me under surveillance just shows what it's like. I mean, keeping one individual under surveillance in a way that they don't notice is, you're lucky if you do it with a dozen people. There's a certain amount that can be automated, and there's a certain amount that can't. But it's still essential. I mean, through the centuries, counterterrorism, it tends to be assumed that it's all rather recent. But the most serious assassination plots against a head of state in Britain were first against Queen Elizabeth I in the later 16th century, and then notably on Guy Fawkes' Day in 1605 against her successor, James the First. And how did it work? Well, James the First was lucky to get away with it because the surveillance wasn't working too well. But the surveillance was working extremely well, so far as Queen Elizabeth I is concerned. So there is no credible form of counterterrorism which avoids surveillance, which raises all kinds of issues about human rights, all kinds of issues about resources. They're not easy, but they have to be overcome.
It just seems that we're lurching towards the complete surveillance state, like what China's doing now with, as I said, facial recognition, where you're actually tracked. So you're tracked and recorded. Going to a supermarket, whether you're buying nappies, you'll get a credit.
Yeah.
If you're buying alcohol, you're losing credit. You've got a credit score, which means it makes it easy for you to get a credit card. And
Well, the
are you
program,
comfortable with that? I mean,
there are differences, and there ought to be differences between the purposes for which the surveillance is used. Now, in Britain, one can argue whether there is enough control, but the Investigatory Powers Act and the various controls that exist are not foolish, and they do serve some purpose. But of course, there is nothing like that in China. The best title of a book that I have read about China in recent years is one in which the title is The People's Republic of Amnesia. The ability to ban information. One of the half dozen best words in the West about Chinese history is Tiananmen. Tiananmen Square today contains the Chinese main museum of modern history, but it is completely taboo. And internet searches are so heavily controlled that you cannot search any combination of 9, 6, and 1989 Why? Because the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred on the 9th of June, 1989. So, alas, there is no doubt that effective surveillance can make despotisms more despotic than they used to be, and that is the case in China. We will know that serious dialogue with the Chinese about international relations is possible when they do what Gorbachev did in the 1980s, clear up the blank spot. In other words, it became possible to talk about the Nazi-Soviet Pact and other horrors in the past. So long as the Tiananmen Square massacres are not discussable in China, and so far as surveillance extends even to people who want to understand the basic facts of their own history, there is a problem to which no solution is immediately available.
I'm just wondering whether you think the Edward Snowdens of the world are the only hope for some sort of freedoms.
Whistleblowers have their place, but the Snowden example is, it seemed to me, seriously misunderstood in two ways. He has had not a fraction of the effect these revelations about surveillance and the activities of the British and the American, mainly the American, but also the British secret agencies. He's had nothing like the effect of the revelation in 1844 that a popular Italian revolutionary nationalist, Giuseppe Mazzini, who was exiled in London, the revelation that his correspondence was being intercepted led to a huge uproar in both the media and the parliament. And it was such an uproar that the British secret agency, the ancestor of today's GCHQ, was closed down and remained closed down for the next 70 years until the outbreak of World War I. So that's the first point. The second point is that even though Snowden has got a lot of publicity, quite understandably, it's actually whistleblowers in authoritarian regimes that have told us more than he has told us. So the material that Vasily Mitrokhin, now in Churchill College Archives, Cambridge, brought out, it took him over a dozen years to collect it, shows about what the KGB was up to. That is, fills in a bigger gap than Snowden. And again, the fact that we know so much more about the appalling gulag of Kim Jong-un, which is far worse than Stalin's ever was, has to do with surveillance from spy satellites, which of course didn't exist in Stalin's time, but also whistleblowers. So it's penetrating authoritarian regimes rather than exposing the vices, whether exaggerated or not, of fundamentally democratic regimes, which it seems to me that the Snowdens of this world have the biggest contribution to make.
I liked one of your stories in the book about the Great Exhibition and the fact that the authorities were concerned about the revolutionary assassins disguising themselves as trees. What's the crazy story you ever came across in your research? Are there any loony stories?
Yes, there are some loony stories. The problem is picking out the looniest. I mean, all the conspiracy theories are lunatic, but in the end, Hitler's belief that international Jewry was plotting the destruction of Aryan civilization, whereas in fact, of course, German Jewry was at the heart of a lot of German culture. I think it's difficult to think of a balmier conspiracy theory than that. But again, if one looks for competition, the people to go to are the autocrats. Now, bizarre though it may seem, at the beginning of the Second World War, Stalin regarded dealing with the Trotskyist conspiracy by killing Trotsky thousands of miles away in Mexico City with extremely little support, who did what Trotskyists always do, argue with each other, as a higher priority than keeping track of Adolf Hitler. So The more authoritarian people are, the sillier the conspiracy theories they will have, and the sillier will be their understanding of intelligence.
But lastly, do you have any plans for book 18?
Yes. I am currently writing a book which is called Stars and Spies. We may change the title. And I'm writing that with a very successful West End producer. And it's about the interaction between espionage and the theatre. So let me give you just one example. What is striking nowadays, and that is true of John le Carré and Ian Fleming and so on, is the number of people who write about intelligence who are actually involved in it. The very first was a graduate of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, my college. His name was Christopher Marlowe. At the age of 21, he became a spy as well. And because he outpaced Shakespeare to begin with, he was actually, at the time when he was assassinated at the age of only 29, the leading playwright in Britain. Now, what new research credibly shows is not to vindicate the silly old story that Shakespeare wrote Marlowe or Marlowe wrote Shakespeare, but that they did actually collaborate at the beginning of the 1590s. So if you look in the new Oxford Shakespeare, which has got the main editions, a quarto, folio, and a few others, and you look up Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, which was written in the early 1590s, what it actually says, and the three Oxford editors of this are not people who go wildly out on a limb. Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, by William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Now, what did that do? It changed Shakespeare's views about this and that. He becomes the first English writer, and this is in Richard III, 1592, to use the word intelligence in the modern sense. And he goes on to write what are probably the best known play, and it's reasonable to conclude that Marlowe had some posthumous influence on what is probably the most famous play in the entire history of drama, Hamlet. Because Hamlet is the first play in which a majority of the characters spy on a majority of the others. And it has this extraordinary intelligence operation at the end. So the king, having got fed up with Prince Hamlet, sends him off to England with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who, by the way, were real, and the Hamlets were imaginary. But Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were real people at the Danish court. And they carry with them a little letter addressed to the ruler of England saying, as soon as Prince Hamlet arrives, kindly dispose of him. Well, Hamlet, in an intelligence operation on the voyage, opens the letter and inserts another one, which says, on the arrival of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, kindly dispose of them as quickly as possible. So just at the end of the play, this almost comic message comes from England. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, which 400 years later leads to the play by Tom Stoppard of the same name, which had a memorable revival at the beginning of 2018. So the future lies in the interaction between espionage and drama, and I'm onto it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Tea time.